A reading from the Gospel of Mark. He left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, "Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. Then Jesus said to them, "Prophets are not without honor except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house." And he could do no deed of power there except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. And he was amazed at their unbelief. Then he went about among the villages teaching. He called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He ordered them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not to put on 2 tunics. He said to them, "Wherever you enter a house, stay there until you leave the place. If any place will not welcome you and they refuse to hear you as you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet as testimony against them." So they went out and proclaimed that all should repent. They cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and cured them. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Where did this man get all this wisdom? Isn't he the carpenter, the son of Mary and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And aren't his sisters here with us? The small town kid is back, and the townspeople haven't forgotten him. How could they? They remember when this man was just a boy chasing after the ice cream truck with his brothers or swimming at the YMCA with his sisters. They remember when he would play with his weird cousin who preferred to piddle around in his bug collection rather than playing football in the yard with the others. Locusts were his favorite. They still run into Mary at the grocery store from time to time, and she mostly keeps to herself. Everyone knows that she's worried sick about Jesus. Just the other day, some gossipy mechanics were whispering about his strange new movement. "I hear Herod's pretty miffed about Elizabeth's boy," she overhears one of them saying. "Mary might want to tell that boy of hers to watch his back. Poor Mary can't even get an oil change in peace." The people in our hometowns often know us better than anyone, don't they? They know the house we grew up in, the schools we went to, the crowds we ran with, the illnesses we carried, the trophies we hoisted, and the trouble we got into. No matter who we turn out to be, no matter how much vision or wisdom we cultivate, or how many miracles we perform, homecoming can make it really hard to escape our past. Some of you know what I'm talking about. But what if Jesus turns all of this on its head? What if it's our past that cannot escape Jesus? In Siddhartha Mukherjee's insightful book, The Gene, An Intimate History, he describes an American movement that sought to make mainstream the idea that the human race could improve itself through selective breeding. It was believed that by spreading good traits and isolating bad ones, humanity could reach the apex of health and happiness. This movement was known as eugenics. Perhaps you've heard of it. The book describes how in the 1920s, millions of Americans flocked to county fairs where, alongside toothbrushing demonstrations, popcorn machines, and hay rides, the public encountered better baby contests. In these events, children as young as 1 or 2 years old were propped up on a pedestal as physicians poked and prodded at them, examining their features to determine the healthiest and fittest of the contestants. The winners were then paraded through the fairs and featured in popular magazines throughout the country. The person who created the evaluation criteria was a Harvard-trained zoologist who instructed the judges to never judge a baby without first judging her parents. After all, he said, a prize winner at 2 years old may be an epileptic at 10. Wow. Now, perhaps you're assuming that such a disgusting spectacle could only be sponsored by right-wing extremists or some such thing. And while it was indeed Nazi Germany that took eugenics to a whole new level, this pseudo-scientific program began hand in hand with the progressive movement. In the early 1900s, it was Ivy League professors and writers for The Nation magazine that championed the idea that things naturally progress or improve with the forward movement of history. And they were not shy about engineering those improvements themselves. Of course, progressives don't get a monopoly on eugenics all because they created it. Just a year and a half ago, the current U.S. Attorney General praised the Immigration Act of 1924, which was designed by a fanatical eugenicist who used this fake science to support the exclusion of Italians, Jews, Africans, and Middle Easterners from American society. This ought to shed a little bit of light on what's happening on our southern borders today. It's not just about protecting our economy or keeping communities safe. Today's so-called zero-tolerance policy has a much more sinister pedigree. You know, Jesus probably would not have won one of those Better Baby contests. In our text today, Jesus is referred to as the Son of Mary. At the time, this would have been quite an unusual way to identify a man because sons were usually identified with their father's name. We would expect to hear the townspeople refer to him as the son of Joseph. So why don't we? Well, because he's considered by some people in Nazareth to be illegitimate, a bastard, if you will. He's not as desirable as the others, and the legitimacy of his teachings and his miraculous works are called into question by the illegitimacy of his birth. Aren't you Mary's son? Mary's son, not Joseph's? The townspeople reject him because they remember something about his past. And just as a tainted past gets in the way of progress, so a tainted past gets in the way of our credibility. Sure, these wise teachings and miracles might make Jesus look like a prize winner, but judge his parents first. Kids born out of wedlock or raised without fathers, we're often told, just grow up to be thugs, right? A prize winner at 30 might be a crucified criminal at 33. So the townspeople, they take offense at him. You see, this is a homecoming, and the townspeople know Jesus. They know him. But knowledge is a delicate thing, isn't it? It teeters between intimacy and control. To love a spouse, as many of you know, is to know a spouse, to pay attention to the intricacies of her movements, her quirky facial expressions, her 5 different laughs, the tone of her voice when you've done something you shouldn't have, her complicated relationship with her uncle, and the exact shape of the scar from her appendectomy. It reminds me of a scene from Lady Bird, a coming-of-age film about a disgruntled girl from Sacramento who desperately wants to leave her home. In an essay for her college application, she unwittingly writes about her fondness for Sacramento. She intends to write about her upbringing in more abstract terms, but the intimate details about her home just bleed through. She's called to the office by a teacher who's reviewing the essay, and after a few moments of discussing the girl's remarkable aptitude for writing, the teacher leans over and gently says, "It's clear you love Sacramento." This comes as a shock to the girl, who was sure she wanted to leave the barren suburbs of her upbringing. "I guess I just pay attention," she says. And the teacher's reply drives home the movie's takeaway. "Don't you think they're the same thing?" she asks. "Love and attention." Yeah, love is attention. Love is attention turned to intimate knowledge. But again, when it comes to knowledge, there is a fine line between intimacy and control. To love a spouse is to know a spouse. But if you claim to know everything about your spouse, you suffocate the mystery of his being, the openness of his future, and the horizons of possibility for what he is yet to become. When we claim to fully comprehend a person, we effectively claim to hold them in our grasp, to control them, to domesticate them, to create them in our image. That is not love. If knowledge is power, this kind of knowledge is perverse power. It's the kind of knowledge the townspeople had of the small town kid, Jesus. "Hey, isn't he the carpenter? He's just one of us, y'all. He's an American, a capitalist, a socialist, a mystic, a social justice warrior, a progressive." But before knowledge is power, power is knowledge. Who gets to decide what it means to make progress? Who gets to decide what's desirable or undesirable, good genes or bad genes? Well, powerful people and their ideologies do. How do we know that history is triumphantly marching forward? Well, because powerful people and their ideologies tell us so. Power is knowledge. So it's always a good idea to ask ourselves, whose history are we talking about here? One of my favorite pieces of art is a painting by Paul Klee called Angelus Novus, or New Angel. It was completed in 1920 when the American progressive movement was in full swing and babies were being judged by their genetic makeup around county fairs. In 1940, the painting was purchased by the philosopher Walter Benjamin, a German Jew who fled persecution under the Nazis' own eugenics program. In Benjamin's interpretation of the painting, he describes an angel that seems to be staring at us, the viewers. But actually, he says, the angel's face is turned toward the past, which is not really a chain of events, but rather a single stormy catastrophe that piles wreckage upon wreckage at his feet. The storm of history, writes Benjamin, catches the angel's wings with such violence that he can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows toward the sky. This storm is what we call progress. Benjamin knew the consequences of progress as well as anyone. He knew that power is knowledge, which is why visions of progress were cast by powerful dictators who, in his case, wanted to make Germany great again. Such a vision had no place for Jews or people with disabilities or people of different sexual orientations. And if we are not careful to be good stewards of our language and our sources of information today, we too could find ourselves immersed in a vision of progress that excludes so-called infestations, animals, snakes, or whatever other nouns are being used to dehumanize our neighbors south of the border. But first, we really need to abandon this idea that history is moving forward or progressing. The era of progress has seen 2 world wars and other wars and numerous genocides. It's all wreckage, as Paul Klee's angel recognized. And none of us really knows what history is supposed to look like, do we? At least, not without looking to Jesus, we don't. And that's what the people of Nazareth failed to do in our story today. Isn't he the carpenter, the son of Mary, the illegitimate one? Yeah, they're judging him by his past, but they're really judging him by their own standards of history. Weaklings don't become messiahs. Victims of state-sponsored executions don't become saviors. Illegitimate sons don't become prophets. The townspeople judge the life of Jesus by their history rather than judging their history by his life. They've made him in their own image, exerting knowledge as power over him so they can control him. But Jesus doesn't need to run from his past, because his entire life, his past, his present, and his future is creating a new history. It's our past that cannot escape Jesus. We must always remember that Jesus, yes, he was a figure in history, but not merely just another figure in history. He was and is and always will be the Lord of history. And because of that, this carpenter has built a new house of knowledge. And this knowledge is not about control. It's about paying attention. My good friend John recently took a retreat to the Benedictine Abbey of Christ in the desert, a monastery located in northern New Mexico. Only a few hours into his stay, he became restless for work. Winter was approaching, so pulling weeds would be pointless, but he chose to do so anyway. About an hour into his labor, he asked himself, by giving myself unnecessary work to do, what am I admitting about myself? I didn't want to work. I didn't have to work. I hadn't even been assigned any work. But I felt like I was supposed to work. Now, John's a Catholic, and he's spent a good deal of time thinking about the 7 deadly sins, and he concluded that this anxious dissatisfaction he felt that morning was sloth. We often equate sloth with laziness or idleness, but that's not really how the medieval theologians thought about it. For them, and this may come as a surprise to some of us, sloth is the inability to enjoy leisure. That's why Thomas Aquinas, for example, claimed that sloth is a sin against the 3rd commandment, to keep the Sabbath holy. It's a sin against rest. Being a workaholic for medieval Christians is slothful because it encourages us to constantly produce and consume creation rather than finding ourselves centered in creation. Sloth is the posture of being unable to receive gifts, while leisure is a posture of stillness, serenity, and contemplation, so we can receive God's gifts. Leisure, in a word, is about paying attention. And isn't paying attention the same thing as love? A new creation has dawned, my friends, and it's not contained by our histories or our frameworks of thinking. All of that is old creation. All of it is wreckage. But to see the new thing being done in Jesus Christ, we need to slow down and rest, especially in this time of such immense anxiety. Turn the television off from time to time, will you? Lower the volume on all the noise in your life. For God's sake, stay away from the mall for a few days. Watch the clouds form overhead. Take your shoes off and feel the grass beneath your feet. Slouch in your favorite chair and listen to Beethoven. Watch the branches tremble in the wind. Center yourselves in creation. Be at leisure and pay attention. I made myself sit and observe without working, John said. I watched two ravens spiral overhead, then head off to the east over the mesa. And I listened to the locust rev its wings near my feet. In times such as these, let's do likewise. If we pay close enough attention, we might be surprised by what we find. The carpenter who comes into our midst might not be who we thought he was. And we might just find that before we knew anything about him, he knew us first. Amen.